I don't know what's going on here. I gotta figure it out.
What doofus?
What's up, guys? In this video we're going to be talking about how I made these raised panel doors in this side hutch. This was my first time making any raised panel doors, so it came with a lot of complications and problems, so I wanted to separate it into its own video. The first thing I would say is make sure you anticipate having a lot of scraps to use as practice samples. And I mean a lot of scraps. Make sure to subscribe so you can see the build of this whole sideboard as well as the build of this top. Now let's get into this little build. So I've been trying to make some raised panel doors, and I actually shot a bunch of footage already thinking I knew what I was doing, and it didn't work out. So I'm going to scrap most of that footage and start over. But this is the concept I came up with a little while ago. It has a tongue and groove system on the rails and stiles. So there's the tongue. There's the groove, and then it has a raised panel section in the middle. The problem I'm running into is to get the measurements just right for what I need, so I'm going to start over and see if I can do this a little bit better. The problems I was running into is sometimes I was cutting the grooves a little bit too wide or too deep or too shallow, and sometimes I was cutting the tongues a little bit too long, and things just weren't matching up like they needed to. This one was a little bit better, but then by the time I did that, the groove was too wide. Also, when I was cutting the grooves, sometimes they weren't straight, so I'm developing a system to solve all these problems. One of the best things you can do is come up with a bunch of practices and samples before you start cutting into your project, which is the mistake that I made. I have a lot of project material that I think I'm going to have to scrap and start over. So the first sample I'm going to make is the panel with the dimensions of the cuts that I think I want. So I'll have a sample in order to fit into the grooves after they're cut. I set my table saw blade to about 1/8 of an inch above the surface in order to cut a small pattern in the board. And then I set this gauge to 1 3/4 inches, which is what I think the width of my slanted part of the raised panel is going to be. Alright, so this is how the raised panel starts off, and now I just need to cut this at a slant is the next step, and I have this jig right here that fits over my table saw fence in order to help me do that. I'm starting with the saw blade set at 15 degrees to see how that works out, and now I have to continue to make sure that the saw blade comes, make sure that the saw blade comes right to the inside of this groove right here. I'm going to clamp my piece to this fence in order to keep it steady as it goes through the blade. Alright, so you can see I need to raise my blade a little bit to take off the rest of that material coming up to the groove. Alright, so now what I'm noticing is the saw blade is not fully taking off the material building up to the groove on the vertical. So there's a little bit more, so that means I need to move the fence just a smidgen closer to the blade. I think that basically is what I'm looking for. So I'm going to mark the measurement on my fence and save that for later. So I went ahead and cut one more side, so I have two sides to work with. The next thing I need to do is to flatten out the first little part of this, and I'll do that with the router. Alright, after a little bit of trial and error, I think I got what I'm looking for with the panel. It's a 12-degree cut, and I flattened it out with the router there to go into the groove. Now the tricky part is doing the tongue and the groove like I need them to end up. I'm doing 1/2 inch tongues and 1/2 inch grooves, and a lot of people have fancy little tools for that. But I have this, which I measured to be 1/2 inch, so I'm going to use this 1/2 inch as my gauge for setting the saw blade. For the groove, I just need to eyeball the center and then turn it around 180 degrees and pass back the other way, and then I'll have a centered starter groove. Now I just need to shift the fence slightly off-centered and do the same thing. So I'll take a little bit of material off of both sides and it'll stay centered. I'll cut here, flip it over, cut again. Now that I got the groove, it's time to make the tongue, so I need to drop the saw blade to the height, exactly to the height of one of these sides. And I'm going to use my 1/2 inch gauge here to set the fence 1/2 inch. Actually, once I set that gauge, I also need to reduce it by the kerf of the blade, which I believe is 1/16 of an inch. Okay, now that I got all my measurements written down in a system that I think works, I'm going to try it on my actual material here. Here I go. So it still took me quite a while, but I think finally I have the tongue and groove system of the two side doors finished. Now I have to move on to the panels. So the panels are going to be as wide as the rails, except add 1 inch for a 1/2 inch on each side. And then it's going to be, I'm going to have to measure the other dimension. But anyway, it's the opening plus a 1/2 inch all the way around. Alright, here's the panel. So I only got one shot at this, so let's hope I cut it right. According to my notes for the small groove, I set my fence to 1 3/4. Alright, now my notes say set the saw blade to 12 degrees and don't focus, and then the distance of 7/8 plus 1/16, which is just the way I wrote it down. Alright, so 7/8 plus a 16th is 15/16. I know that. So my test piece is what I use to set the height of the blade when it's already set to 12 degrees. Alright, now it's time to flatten out this edge right here so it'll be accepted by the panel. Or so the panel will be accepted by the stiles and rails. Alright, let's go ahead and do a dry fit. Took me all day to do these two doors, but I think it's finally time to glue them up. All right, thanks for watching that video. It's not much of a tutorial as much as it is a journey. I hope you can go on your own journey and figure something like this out for yourself. It's not too hard. It's worth a try. So good luck to you. And as always, don't be afraid to be a doofus.